This video is a beginner's guide to Final Cut Pro 11. I'm going to show you how to import your media, create a basic timeline, add in some titles, transitions, and effects, plus take a look at some of the new features inside of Final Cut Pro 11. Then at the very end, I'm going to show you how to export your masterpiece so the rest of the world can enjoy it. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into it. When you first open up Final Cut Pro, it should look something like this. In the top left-hand corner, we have an untitled library. This is the default library that comes with Final Cut Pro out of the box. You totally could do all of your editing inside of this library if you wanted to, but I personally like to know exactly where my library is and to create a new library with every single project that I make. To create a new library, just go on up to File, New, and then select Library. It'll bring up this dialog window, and in here we can rename it to what we like. So I'm just gonna call it My First Library. Next, we can choose where we want to save this. By default, it's going to be in your Movies folder. So this is a great place to look if you happen to lose your library. You can always click on this down arrow to expand it and locate the specific folder that you want to work with. Now that I've found my folder, I can go ahead and press Save. On the left-hand side, you should have both your untitled library that it first created, as well as the new library that we've just made. From there, we can go ahead and right-click on the untitled library and select Close Library so that we only have the one library that we've created. Now, taking a look at this library, you should notice a couple things. First is this Smart Collection Zone. This is something I'm not going to cover inside of this video because it's not extremely important to know as a beginner, but the next thing you should take note of is the event. So what exactly is a library? Well, I like to think of libraries as libraries in the real world. Libraries in the real world have thousands and thousands of different books, and I like to think of those books as my video clips or whatever media I'm bringing in. But inside of a library, there's also a lot of different shelves, and those shelves are used to categorize your footage. So I like to think of events more as shelves as in a library. So I use events to categorize my footage in various ways and to almost use them as a folder. This is really up to your own personal workflows, but my favorite workflow is to create a new library for every single project and then to further categorize my footage inside of that library by using event. You can always create a new event by right-clicking on your library and then selecting New Event. Now, by default, Final Cut Pro is going to create an event, and this is where all your media is going to be imported to when you bring it into Final Cut Pro. And speaking of importing your media, how do we do that? First, you can see there's this mega button here in the middle of your browser. This button is going to disappear once you bring in your media, so it's good to get in the habit of importing from some other locations. The first and easiest way to import your media is up here in the top left-hand corner, and you'll see this import button indicated with a down arrow. You can click on that, and that's going to bring up this big import window. Now, the import window is all well and good, but I personally like to import my media by dragging it in directly from Finder. I just find it's a lot easier to navigate specifically through Finder compared to this import window, so I rarely touch this import window unless I absolutely need to. I'm going to go ahead and close the import window and instead go to Finder. From there, I'm going to locate the folder that I want to import from. To get all of the footage in that I've created for this video, I'll locate it in my Assets folder, and in here we can see I have images, stock videos, and music. I don't have any images for this particular project, I just have stock videos and music, so I'm only going to import those two folders. So I'm going to go ahead and create a box selection over both of those and click and drag. And as I bring it over into Final Cut Pro, we should see this add symbol by the arrow. If you're not seeing the addition symbol by your arrow, that probably means that you actually have your library selected instead of the event. Final Cut Pro always needs to bring your media into an event of some sort. So you're not going to see this addition symbol if you're trying to bring it into the library. You can either just make sure that your event is selected, or you can simply click and drag your footage directly into an event. Once you do that, you should see that addition symbol, and I'll go ahead and release, and now we've imported our footage. You'll remember that we had two separate folders that I was bringing in, one that said stock videos and one that said music. They're separated out into keyword keyword collections automatically. So by taking a few moments before I import my footage into Final Cut Pro and categorizing everything in various folders, I've gone ahead and automatically organized it inside of Final Cut Pro, which we can then find inside of these keyword collections. If you want to see all of your media at the same time and you don't want them segregated into these separate folders, you can always select the event, and now you can see both my music and all of my various video clips. So we've imported our media and it's time to create our masterpiece. We first need to create a timeline. To create a timeline, you can go ahead and find this big button that says New Project. But again, you're not always going to have access to this big New Project button, so you're going to need to find some other locations for creating a new project. The simplest and fastest way is to simply use a keyboard shortcut of Command N, but if you don't like to use keyboard shortcuts, you can also just go on up to File, New, and then select Project. I'll go ahead and create this project and it will bring up this dialog window allowing me to rename it. So let's just call this my first project, and it's gonna ask you which event to place this in. Again, Final Cut Pro always needs to know what event things are going into, just like when we're importing our media. We'll leave it as the default, and underneath that is the starting timecode. You don't need to worry about starting timecode. That's for a whole other more technical video. Underneath that, you'll see that the video with its settings are currently set based on the first video clip properties. This is super handy if you don't know exactly what settings your footage needs to be at and you just want it to be the exact same as how it was originally filmed. So what I mean by that is if I were to select this clip here, we can see in the top left that it's at 4K resolution at a frame rate of 29.97. So if I were to bring this media to my timeline, that timeline would automatically get those settings. However, if you do know the specific settings that you would like and you don't want it to be automatic, you can always come to the bottom left-hand corner and press Use Custom Settings. In here, we can change our format between 1080p, 4K, and you can also select square, vertical, and spatial aspect ratios here. You can change your resolution on each of the various settings, and you can change your frame rate. For this video, I'm gonna go ahead and edit at 29.97, but if you want something that feels a little bit more cinematic, which is kind of my preferred way of editing, you might wanna try out 24 frames per second. If you are one of my good friends across the pond, you might wanna try out 25p. And finally, if you're trying to create vlogs or maybe tech content, you can always try out 29.97. After that, you don't really need to worry about this rendering setting just yet. Also, your audio you can leave as the defaults for right now. From there, we can go ahead and push OK. And now we finally have our first project. Anytime we need to get back into this project, we can locate it here in our browser under My First Project. If I created other projects, those projects would also show up here inside of the browser. So now I have this untitled project and My First Project. I'm going to go ahead and undo that untitled project I just created with Command Z, and now we should be back to where we need to be. We have all of our footage inside of Final Cut Pro. We have our timeline ready to go. So how do we get this footage down on the timeline? Well, there's a whole bunch of different ways inside of Final Cut Pro. The first and most common way you're probably going to bring media down onto the timeline is to simply select it by first clicking on it. That will turn it golden around the edges and then dragging it down onto the timeline. But you'll notice if I were to place this media way over here on the right hand side and release it, the media is going to immediately snap to the far left hand side. This is what's known as the magnetic timeline, and I'm going to get a little bit more into it in just a moment. Now, the reason you first need to click to create the selection and turn it golden is because if instead I just simply click and drag over a clip, it's immediately going to create this smaller selection, and that's going to create an in and out point for that exact part of media. Now, when I drag this down, only the selection I've created will show up in that clip. Another great way to get exact parts of the video that you want is to simply scroll forward ahead in the video, then push I for your in point, and then to find your out point, you can push O. So again, only that specific part of video will show up down on the timeline. Now, you can just drag your media down to the timeline if that's your preferred way of working, but there's also some super handy buttons down here in the bottom left side of the viewer. Let's go ahead and zoom in on our timeline with Command plus or minus. And if you have a trackpad, you can actually just pinch to zoom in and out. So to take advantage of some of these different modes, let's first select a clip. Going to the bottom left-hand side, we can see there's this first button, which is to connect a clip to the timeline. You can get that with Q or again by clicking that icon. What this has done is it's placed the clip above my other clip down on the timeline, and it's attached it to that clip through this connection point. You can see that blue line. I'll get more in depth on that in just a moment when I'm covering the magnetic timeline, but that is what that does. It places the clips above the clips that are down on the timeline wherever your playhead is here on the timeline. Again, select this clip and I'll push Q, and now it's on top of everything. The next icon is going to insert your clip on the timeline. So for example, I'll select this clip here and press insert, or we can get that with W. And what that is going to do is it's going to create a cut in my primary clip that was already there on the timeline. It will then insert the clip in the middle of those two cut points, placing them on the left and right side. So like I said, it is going to insert it on the timeline. I'm going to undo that with Command Z, and looking at the next icon, this is going to append your clip. So this is going to place whatever clip you have selected at the very end of your magnetic timeline. Let's select this waterfall clip and push E, or we can push that icon right here. And just like that, you can see this video clip is already at the end of the timeline, which is super handy. This is probably my most used of these various shortcuts because I can just simply select a clip, E, select a clip, E, and just very quickly get all my media down onto the timeline. Let's undo that with Command Z. And finally, we'll take a look at the last mode, which is the overwrite clip mode. You can get this with D. Just like it says, is going to overwrite whatever clip is down on the timeline. Let's select this beautiful clip here and push D. And just like that, we have overwritten any of the media that was already on the primary timeline, and we can now see our clip here just as we would expect. But there is one last mode I want to cover when it comes to dropping clips down on your timeline. Maybe you're bringing down an interview clip and you don't want the video element with the audio. Or maybe you have an element where you really like the audio of a clip, but you don't want the video with it. Well, that is where this next mode comes into play, and we can change that mode by clicking this down arrow. So now we have access to see all of the clip, which will be video and audio linked together, or we can do video only mode, which will bring down only the video, or we can select audio only and we will only extract the audio from a given clip. When we jump to one of these modes, as we either click and drag it down on the timeline or use one of these various insert modes that we've selected here, just the audio or just the video is going to be applied down on the timeline. And then of course, you can always get back to the original mode by clicking on all or by pushing Shift 1. Now you can also make a batch selection up here in your viewer and then just simply click and drag all of the clips down on the timeline. We can zoom out with Command minus, or we can also push Shift Z, which is going to zoom our timeline to fit whatever is inside of the timeline. So we have our media down on the timeline. It's time to start editing it. The most common way you're probably going to edit a clip is by either trimming or by blading. To trim a clip, you'll just need to bring your mouse to the edge of your clip, and depending on if you want to trim the clip on the left or on the right, you'll need to place your mouse in that position. If I wanted to trim this clip on the left side, I would make sure my mouse is on the left of that cut point, and then we'll select it, and then we'll just click and drag to trim it back. Again, if we want the clip on the right, we'll move our playhead to the right-hand side, click and drag, and that will create that cut. If you see the edge turn red, that means that there is no longer any media in that selection. So I can't make this go any further. Let's just go ahead and trim this back a bit, just like so, and we should be good to go. So we can go ahead and trim up all these various clips as we want to create the edit of our dreams. But another super common way you're going to be creating a cut is through blading. To get your blade tool, you can either go the long route of coming over here to your tools, clicking this down arrow, and then selecting the blade tool. But my preferred way of getting the blade tool is by simply pressing B on the keyboard. Because you're going to use this so much, I strongly suggest that you learn this keyboard shortcut. So just press B when you want the blade tool, and to create a cut, we can just simply click on the clip where we want that cut to be made. You'll notice now that I've created that cut, we've made a dotted line. And that's a different line type from one of these more solid types. When the line is solid, that means it's a completely different moment in time for the clip, or maybe they're just completely different clips altogether. If it's a dotted line though, that means it's a continuation of the previous moment of the clip. So if I were to push play, we would never even notice that there was a cut that was happening there. And what's really cool about the dotted line is we can actually just simply remove it by using the arrow tool and pressing delete. So to get my arrow tool, we can either go the long route of coming over here to the left side to get our tools and getting the selection tool, or we can just push A on our keyboard, which is the faster route. Now that we have our arrow tool, I can click on that cut and then just press backspace or delete, whatever it says on your keyboard, and now that cut will be removed. This is super handy for those moments where you accidentally create cuts on your timeline that you didn't intend, and you don't want to have a whole bunch of various edit points that just shouldn't be there. But with your blade tool, that often means that you want to remove a center section of a clip. We can go ahead and push B to get our blade tool. And another super handy tip is rather than going and pressing B and then A and then B and then A, you can actually just hold down B, and that will give you the blade tool. I'll click to create a cut, and once I release B, it's now going to give me back to the previous tool I had, which in this case is the arrow tool. We'll hold down B, create a secondary cut, release B, and now we have our arrow tool. And now I can select that clip in the center. I could move this clip around by just simply clicking and dragging and placing it wherever I want in the timeline, or I can just push backspace or delete, and that will remove that clip completely. So now we've created a cut, and you'll notice that the cut point between these two clips is solid, meaning they're going from one segment of the video to another that are completely different in time. So that's kind of the core principle of editing inside of Final Cut Pro. You'll either be trimming to create your selections, or you'll be using the blade tool to create a selection. So B, click, click, A, delete, and you're good to go. But as I've been creating these edits, you might have noticed something with the media. Once I delete a certain section, the clips to the right of it have gone left, and that is the magnetic timeline at play. The magnetic timeline is often one of the most difficult parts to comprehend with Final Cut Pro when you first start out, but once you grasp it, it is easily Final Cut Pro's most powerful tool. I strongly recommend that you really try and learn the magnetic timeline. Just go along with the process and learn the various tools that are necessary, because it will increase your editing speed by magnitudes of factors. It's absolutely insane once you become a proficient editor how good the magnetic timeline is. Now this video isn't going to go super in-depth on the magnetic timeline, but I do have another really powerful in-depth video on the magnetic timeline that I'll link at the end of this video. So once you finish watching this one, make sure you go check out that video if you want a better grasp on it. But here's the basics. As I said earlier, we can create our cuts, select them and delete them, and the clips will all slide to the left-hand side. But another important factor of the magnetic timeline is that clips that are either above or below the timeline will not get those magnetic properties. You'll only see that magnetized factor when it's in this dark area of the timeline. So now that this clip is above the timeline, I can move it wherever I need to. You'll also notice that it has that connection stem. That connection stem is super important to be aware of. So you can easily see where a clip is connected through that stem. You can lift it up, or you can just take a close look here at the clips. And by default, it's always going to be on the farthest left-hand side of a clip. When a clip is connected, that means that I can select an entirely other clip that's in the primary timeline and move it over here to the right. Those clips are going to push to the left side. These clips will stay where they are on the right side. It's really powerful, but you'll also notice that that clip came with it. So this is so incredibly powerful because we can have the clips above, we can have our music below, and it will all stay attached as necessary. But what if you don't want this clip to be connected to this clip? Maybe you want it to be attached to another moment in the timeline. Well, you just need to push and hold Command and Option at the same time, and then while you're holding those down, click to create the point where you want the new connection to be made. So now we are no longer attached to this clip, and you can see that as I drag this over. The connection point is being made right here. So if I move this clip, it's attached there. Knowing just this one tip is going to save you so much headache with the magnetic timeline and get you that much closer to mastering it. But there's one other super important tip I want to point out with the magnetic timeline. Maybe you don't want this clip attached to anything down on your primary timeline. That is where the tilde or graph key comes into play. It's just below the escape key on US keyboards. If you don't have a United States keyboard, you're going to need to add in a keyboard shortcut for override connections. This video can't get into that, but if you push and hold that tilde key, you'll notice that I get this small orange icon next to my cursor. That indicates that now the clips are no longer connected. So I can click and drag this specific clip, drag that to the left side, and this clip will stay locked in place. There are quirky scenarios where this clip might move over to the right side anyway. I again don't have time to get into all of that, but just know that that is a great way to lock down your timeline if you ever need to. So that is how to actually edit the media down on your timeline. But what if you want a better view of your media? Because maybe these clips are a little bit too small for your liking, or maybe they're too large, taking up too much screen space. Well, it's super important to be aware of the fact that you can always come over here to this handy little film strip, and in here we can adjust stuff like the zoom level of all the clips. We can adjust how tall the clips are. And there's a whole bunch of other settings that I'm not going to get into right now, but one setting you should be aware of is when you bring in clips with audio, you can either show more audio or less audio by using these various icons right here. Once I have my settings in place, I can go ahead and just click that film strip again, and we should be good to go. So now that we have our basic edit in place, we want to start adding in some effects, because color correction is a huge part of the editing experience, and that is just a regular effect inside of Final Cut Pro. To add in any sort of color correction, we can go ahead and locate our effects here on the right side. It's just the two rectangles together overlapping each other. My effects titles and transitions are going to look quite a bit different on my system because I have a lot of various plugins that I've created and installed. But one effect I know for certain you're going to have, and it will likely be up here in the top left-hand corner, is the color board. This is the default way to color grade inside of Final Cut Pro. To apply the color board, you'll just simply click and drag it onto whatever clip you want to color grade. So in this instance, let's go ahead and color grade our waterfall. Now that that waterfall has that applied, up here in the top right corner under our effects, the color board has been added. If you aren't seeing this effects tab and stuff, just make sure that you're inside of the video inspector using this tab button right here. So the film strip is your video inspector, and in here you can see stuff like your effects, your compositing, transform, crop, distort, a whole bunch of stuff. If you want to make changes to that color board that we've just applied, you'll need to either click on the colorful icon here on the right-hand side, or you can always go to the color inspector. Now that we're in the color inspector, we can get a basic idea of what this color board is doing. And by default, it's doing absolutely nothing. But you'll notice there's these 4 circles happening here on this middle gray line. The far left circle is your global adjustment. So that means your shadows, highlights, and midtones are all being adjusted at the same time. To make an adjustment, you just simply need to click and drag it. Let's say I want everything to go to the reds. We can push this way over to red, and now you can see that global adjustment is being made. But you'll also notice on the underside there's this gray line, and then it's kind of this zebra stripes going on. And even though I'm dragging into the red, everything is shifting blue. Everything above this line is the actual color that you'll be getting, whereas everything below this line is going to be the exact opposite of that that color. And this is important because it's very common inside of color grading to have opposing colors to create a pleasing image. One of the most common color grades is a teal and orange look because those two colors are kind of opposites of each other and it creates a really nice pleasing image. To get that look, we could go on over into our shadows and you'll notice it's already kind of in this teal range. So we just simply need to click and drag this up into the teals. I'm going to take it a little bit further than it should be just for the sake of this tutorial, but this should give you a good idea of how this works. Now that I've kind of got this going in the teal range, I want this gray circle to be going in the orange range. You definitely could just simply click and drag this way over into the oranges if you wanted to, but a super simple way using this color board is to just drag it down into the oranges. So if we come on up to the top left corner, I can disable that. Here it is before and here it is after. Now, if you ask me, this is a terrible color grade, but you can start to see the changes happening there. And you could push this as far as you want to, but this is just showing you the basics of using the tools inside of Final Cut Pro. If you want more information on in-depth color grading, I strongly recommend you check out my friend Dylan John or Eric Lentz, who have amazing tutorials on color grading inside of Final Cut Pro. Let's go ahead and undo this by going to the top right corner and you'll see this undo reset color adjustments button. So now everything's back to how it was originally, but there's also two other tabs that you should be aware of. One is the saturation. So if you want your image to look more saturated globally, we can come to the global saturation here on the far left and drag that up. Or if you want it to be completely black and white, you could just drag this down. Additionally, if you want the darker parts of your image to be more or less saturated, you can just do the shadow adjustments, the midtone adjustments, or the highlight adjustments. On top of saturation, we have access to exposure. So if you want to add more contrast in an image, we could go ahead and drag our dark areas down, our white areas up, and now we've created a little bit more contrast in this scene. But you can also come on over to the far left side if you want a global adjustment to make everything darker or brighter. But color grading is not the only type of effect you're going to be using in Final Cut Pro. There's actually hundreds of different effects that are already built inside of Final Cut Pro that can give you a whole lot of power. To locate those, you'll just need to make sure you're in the effects inspector and you can scroll through all the various categories down here in the lower right corner. You'll notice though that I do have way more categories than you likely have in your Final Cut Pro. And again, that's just because I've installed a lot of various plugins. One super common effect you'll probably be using is under blur. And in here, you'll see there's this Gaussian blur effect. I'll just simply click and drag that onto my clip and now it has the Gaussian blur. But another super easy way to apply an effect onto a clip is to simply have it selected in your timeline and double click. And now we can see that that effect has been applied once again. With any effect inside of Final Cut Pro, you'll typically find controls in your effects inspector. Unlike the color board, which is all contained in its own panel, you'll see all of these various settings out here in the video inspector. I can adjust the amount, I can adjust horizontal, vertical, and blur boost. And these controls are individualized to this specific effect inside of Final Cut Pro. Now, one other super important aspect of Final Cut Pro that was just released is the new magnetic mask inside of Final Cut Pro 11. There is a chance you won't have access to these tools if you don't have the latest version of Final Cut Pro. So just make sure you're up to date and you have all of the system requirements to get the magnetic mask. To use the magnetic mask inside of Final Cut Pro, you have several different options. The first and easiest way is to simply take an effect, say this Gaussian blur, and to drag it directly onto your video clip. You'll see Final Cut Pro is automatically creating a selection of what it thinks you want, and I'll go ahead and release. From there, I can click to create more points in this mask, and that's looking pretty good. But you'll also notice that we're selecting this guy on the left. So I'm gonna go ahead and find the minus button up here in the top left and create some subtraction points. So now we have a nice clean mask. Once we're ready, we can go ahead and push analyze. And now the magnetic mask is going to go through and automatically track everything for us. Once it is done tracking, we're not going to see the effect just yet, so we'll need to go to the top right corner and push done. But now we are only blurring the subject that we've selected, and I actually want to blur everything else. So with magnetic masks and shape masks and anything like that, you can always come on over to the right side and you'll see this tiny circle icon when you hover over a specific effect. Go ahead and click on that icon and then we'll select invert masks. So now you can see that we have blurred everything in the scene except for our subject. And you can actually go in and add in a shape mask, a color mask, or like we just added, the magnetic mask. If you do want to go deeper with the magnetic mask in Final Cut Pro, I do have an in-depth guide on that, which I will link down below. One last super important aspect I want to cover with effects inside of Final Cut Pro is the ability to copy and paste specific effects over to other clips. Let's say I have a black and white effect that I want to apply onto this clip. I'll go ahead and click and drag that onto the clip that I want, and now this clip is black and white. In Final Cut Pro, you have several different ways to copy and paste an effect over. One is to simply locate that specific effect in your effects browser and to simply click and drag it onto another clip. So now this waterfall also has that black and white effect, or we can do the exact same thing with this clip by simply clicking and dragging the black and white effect over there. That is a great way to do it, but it does require a lot of clicking and dragging. So a better way is to simply copy and paste effects when you have a whole lot of clips that you want to receive the same effect. I'm going to undo all of this with Command Z, and now we just have our base clip. I'll apply the black and white effect onto this first clip, and I'm going to push Command C to copy. You can also go up to Edit and then select Copy. Now that I have that clip copied, I can select these other clips that I want to receive the black and white effect, and we can go up to Edit and select Paste Attributes. You can also achieve this with Command-Shift-V, which is my favorite way of doing it. I'll go ahead and do that, and it will give me this dialog window asking me which effects I want to apply. So in this instance, we just want the black and white effect. That looks great, and we can push paste. So now all of these other clips in the timeline are going to receive that exact same black and white effect with any changes we might have applied to that black and white effect. This is so powerful and will speed up your editing so much, so I think it's extremely important to know as a beginner inside of Final Cut Pro. So effects have changed quite a bit inside of Final Cut Pro 11, and I hope that was helpful to you. But let's go ahead and move on to titles. Titles are an essential part of any editor's workflow, and they're very easy to work with inside of Final Cut. To add a title inside of Final Cut, you'll just need to go to the top left corner, and in here you'll see the Titles and Generators tab. Go ahead and select that. When you first open up the titles, it should look something like this. You have tons and tons of different titles to select from, as well as the option to expand out those titles to see different categories. To add in a title in Final Cut Pro, it's ridiculously easy. You just simply click and drag, just like any other clip from your browser, down onto the timeline. You can also get your default title by pressing Ctrl T. I'll go ahead and drop this down on the timeline, and now we have our basic title here. With your titles in your viewer, you can by default click and drag them around because they have this small white box around them. And this is specific to titles. When you select your title, you can go into your text inspector and change the text to whatever you want it to say. So let's just write in subscribe. Next, we can change our font, so I'll go ahead and choose Impact, and we can increase the scale of it. There's a whole bunch of other options you can get into with your titles, which I won't cover right now, but a super important factor is to scroll down and you'll see your face. Your face is going to be the color of your title. To change the color, let's press Show on our face, and now we can find this color chooser. Selecting that should bring up your color picker, and now we can drag this to whatever color we like. Let's just get this to this ugly red so we can clearly see what's going on. I'll close out the color picker. Just beneath that is the option of adding in outlines, glows, and even a drop shadow, which I think you'll probably use the most. To add a drop shadow, click on this checkbox. From there, we can press show and we'll scroll down. Now we can drag up the distance, the blur, and the opacity on that drop shadow, and we can very clearly see it in our video. So that's how you add in a title, but what if we wanted to animate this title? Well, that is where the transform tool comes into play, although you can animate effects that you've applied onto layers, such as the black and white effect or Gaussian blur. To get to the transform tool, you have several different options. One is to make sure you're in the video inspector, and you'll see the transform tab here. Go ahead and press show, and now we have access to stuff like position, rotation, and scale. And it's all well and good to adjust these numbers specifically, but I really like to click and drag directly on my objects. So let's get into the transform mode. We can either press this icon here, or you can also locate it down here in the bottom left-hand corner of the viewer. Once you click on that box, you're gonna see this bounding box around everything, which indicates how large this specific layer is. I can click and drag directly on this to move our text around. We can rotate it, and we can scale it up. Now, moving your text inside of this transform tool is actually different than moving it how we did originally with that small white box. I don't have time to get into the subtle nuances of all that, but just know that they are different. When you move with the transform tool, that enables you to add in animations. To add an animation to almost anything inside of Final Cut Pro, you can come on over to the right side and you should see these small dark diamonds. That is how you add in a keyframe. Let's go ahead and move our playhead to the beginning of our title, and let's say we want to animate the position. I'm going to click to add a keyframe, and I can actually just drag this directly down on the screen. Then we can move forward with our playhead, and we could either adjust the values here or just simply click and drag directly on our text, and you can see that we have now created an animation. Final Cut Pro will automatically add in keyframes for you once you've created one single keyframe. So if we were to push play, we can see that that text is animating in just like so. Another great important tip to know about is adjusting the scale, and just like the position, we can also animate this too. So let's go back to the beginning of our timeline and find our scale, and we can drag this all the way to 0, and then maybe we'll go to the end of our clip and drag this all the way up. So now we should have this text slowly growing. I'll push play, the text comes up, and it's slowly growing over that duration. But what if we decide that this animation is just too slow? Well, there's a really handy tool inside of Final Cut Pro known as the animation editor. To get to it, you'll need to find your clip and right click on it. From there, we can select show video animation, and that's going to expand out. And you'll notice we have these small white dots here on our timeline. These are the different animations that we've created. So if we wanted to speed things up, we could simply find the keyframe that we used to apply to our scale and just click and drag that over to the left-hand side. So pushing play now, the animation will be much faster. So that's the basics of animation inside of Final Cut Pro. You can definitely get super creative with this, and you can apply it not just to the transform tools, but also onto your effects. The last aspect of editing that I want to cover is transitions. Let's say, for example, with this subscribe text, I want it to fade in slowly. We could animate the opacity, but a really great way is to use the default crossfade transition. Let's go on over here to the right side under our transform panel, which looks like a sideways hourglass. In here, you'll see the cross dissolve transition in the top left corner because it's our default transition. To apply it, we simply click and drag just like any other piece of media inside of Final Cut, and let's drag it directly to the middle of our subscribe text. By doing so, we are going to apply it to both sides of our subscribe text. So pushing play, you can see we now have our text slowly fading in. But if we wanted to extend out the duration of this transition, we could simply come to the right side, and you'll notice how my cursor changes, and I can just drag this out and make it as long as I want. So let's push play, and now we can see our text is very slowly fading in. Now there is something super important to be aware of when you apply transitions, and I see beginners get hung up on this all the time. If I were to have media that were extended all the way to its final end duration, so we've got that red line, and we have another clip here that's to the red line. Now both of these clips are at the end of their duration. And if I were to take a transition and apply it onto that, Final Cut Pro is going to bring up this error message saying there's not enough media between the two clips. That's because to apply the transition, it has to take the two clips and essentially create a cut and place them over the top of each other. So we're gonna have to push create transition, and then Final Cut Pro will automatically do all the necessary steps to make those adjustments. But now that transition has been made, we can't extend it any longer because there's no more media to work with. Just be aware of that when you're applying a transition. You might get that error message if you've run out of media to work with. I have another full in-depth video you can check out if you're interested on that specific topic. So we have a video that has all of the titles, transitions, effects, everything we could think of, but we also need to add in some music. And working with audio obviously comes with a lot of subtleties inside of Final Cut Pro, but here are the absolute basics. Let's go on back to our browser in the top left corner. Down here, we'll see our audio. The red indicates that the audio might be a bit too loud in those sections. So just keep note of that. Simply click and drag our audio down on the timeline. Regardless of where I place this audio on the timeline, it's always going to be underneath the magnetic timeline. That's just how Final Cut Pro stays organized. Now that I've dragged this down to the timeline, you should immediately notice this white line in the middle. That is the volume of your audio. And to change the volume on any clip, you can simply click and drag down or up to make it louder or quieter. And again, if it's getting red, that probably means it's too loud. But what if you want to adjust the volume on just a specific part of your music? You have a couple different options. One way is to move your playhead to the specific part where you want the audio to start going down in volume. Then going to the top right, you'll see the volume, and we can actually click to add a keyframe. We can move forward and drag that down. So now you can see that animation taking place here. But I find that's a bit annoying. So instead, go ahead and push Option, and you'll see that your mouse cursor will now allow us to add in keyframe points. So I'll click to add a keyframe, click to add a keyframe. Now I can adjust the volume on the secondary element, and the volume will decrease just like so. But there's one last super important element with audio, because oftentimes you want the volume to duck down, get louder, get quieter, and rather than adding in individual keyframes, I actually prefer to use the range selection tool. To get to it, we can either push R or we can go into our tools and then select range selection. With the range selection tool, I can click and drag to create a selection on a clip, and then I can drop the volume down. Now you can see that Final Cut Pro automatically added in all the necessary keyframes. The volume gets lower and then it gets louder, which is super handy. So that's the basics of working with audio, and there's a lot more nuance to it that I can't get into in this video because it's already so long, but hopefully that gives you some good groundwork. We have a video that has all of the audio, it has the titles, it has the transitions and effects. It's time to export our masterpiece. To export your video from Final Cut Pro, you can always come up to the top right corner to your share menu. Clicking on that, you should see these default settings available. And when you want to export, go ahead and just select Export File. At the top, we can change the name of it. I like My First Project. We can go into our settings and change the format. Now, if you don't know a ton about codecs and you just want to post this onto the internet, I found the best setting is to select Publishing Computer, leaving the video codec at H.264 single pass faster, and leaving your resolution at the highest resolution possible. This is going to dramatically decrease the size of your files, but still give you a good quality result. It also uploads really fast to YouTube, so that's super handy to know. But if you want the maximum ultra quality, you can always go to Video and Audio and make sure your video codec is Apple ProRes 422 or one of these higher values. This is just insane file sizes, and you can see that that makes it a 1.95 gigabyte file for an under 2-minute file. Keep that in mind. In most instances, when you're posting to the internet, you probably don't need that kind of quality. From there, we can go ahead and push Next. We can save it in whatever destination we like and press Save. While it's exporting, come to the top left corner and see the sharing speed. And just like that, we've now exported our video. It's going to open up QuickTime by default, and you can play through and see your beautiful masterpiece. So that is how to get started with Final Cut Pro 11. Hopefully this video was helpful to you, and if it was, I would really appreciate you pressing like, as it does help the channel. Also consider subscribing, as this channel is fully dedicated to teaching Final Cut Pro. I'm gonna have a whole bunch of links down in the description with more ways you can learn Final Cut Pro, and hopefully that gets you started on your Final Cut journey. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I cannot wait to see you in the next one.